Hey everybody, this is Bad at Keeping Secrets. I'm Carissa, and I'm super honored to get to speak today with Sheila Heti. I came into your work, actually a book club was formed because when motherhood came out, I think I had a circle of friends who were all having these conversations about, should I become a mother? Should I, where are we at sort of taking the temperature of options and possibilities. And we all were kind of sitting in this rut of unknowns, I guess. And so we had a book club. We started a book club just to read your book and talk about it. And I think all of us, interestingly enough, decided to have kids after reading Motherhood, which I think is interesting because there are lots of different avenues in the book. But I just wanted to say I'm a really big fan, and that's how I kind of was first introduced to your work. Your new novel, Pure Color, came out earlier this year.
Yeah, February.
It's your 10th book, right? Which is. Do you consider yourself mid-career now?
I guess so.
Sorry,
I would guess so. Yeah.
Someone recently said that to me, and I was like, wait a sec, that doesn't sound right. But then,
I mean, it's not a word that I think about or associate with myself. But if you were to ask, I would have to say yes, but I don't really think about that word very much.
I don't either. And then also we're going to talk about your children's book. This is your second children's book, right?
That's right.
A Garden of Creatures. Both are really beautiful works of art. But I think I wanted to start off with maybe introducing you, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to introduce you as a philosopher, a poet, a writer, a conceptual artist, an editor. Let me see what I'm missing when I think about, there's like a journalist, even though you're not a journalist, but there are elements, I think, of journalism that I see in your work. You're also a memoirist, even though you're not a memoirist. I guess, what did I forget, or are there any of those terms that
I think of myself as a novelist and I guess an interviewer more than a journalist because, well, and I guess I write book reviews as well. I've done a few things that are more like journalism. I wrote a profile of Raffi, the children's entertainer for New York Magazine. That was the most sort of journalism type thing I've done in a long time, but I don't know if I think of myself as a philosopher or a poet, but that's fair if you want to say that.
Well, I think it depends on, again, how you define all of these roles. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about why journalist doesn't sit right with you when thinking about your work.
I just haven't done that much of it. I haven't done that much straight reporting about the world. I think I'm the wrong person to do that. I don't have a very good memory. And I think to be, I mean, I guess journalists take notes. I just don't feel like I have as strong a relationship to the physical world and reality and the my environment as other writers do. So that's really the domain for those kinds of people.
I ask this because I think that what draws me to your work is the sort of collapse of boundaries. And there's something about setting like when to set the firm boundaries and how to use the terms that we're comfortable with in sort of conveying meaning. So it's always, for me, it seems interesting why boundaries should exist in certain places and how terms sort of change over time.
I mean, it makes sense for journalism for that boundary to be a pretty hard boundary, because if you're saying that you're talking about the real world, then you should do your best to talk about the world as it really, the best you can, to be objective and to actually report on what you see around you and not make things up. So I think I don't want to, the reason I like being considered a novelist, or that I consider myself a novelist, is because within the frame of a novel, you can do anything. There really aren't any rules. There's no real transgressions. You can't really cheat in a novel. You can't really lie. It's a place that you can play. You can bring in as much reality as you want, but you can twist things as well. I don't think you're a very good journalist if you take on the rights and liberties of a novelist in your journalism.
So it's sort of the intention, the underlying intention behind both of the acts that matters.
Well, I think it's like the contract that you have with your reader. Like if you're a journalist, the contract that you have with your reader is that you've tried to portray the world as it is, or as close to how it is as you can. Whereas if you're a novelist, you're really trying to portray the world as you subjectively see it or experience it or imagine it. So those are really different contracts, I think.
I think for me, it's not that I don't agree with you, and I think that your distinction is important. I think for me, when reading Pure Color, and admittedly, I'm only halfway through, because I got really sick, but I spent last night reading the beginning of chapter 2, or is it part 2? I can't remember the term you use. And I don't know what I should say about the book, but a lot of it is focused around, I guess, grief and art and transfer of energy. And for me, this was depictive of, in some ways, a more true or authentic portrait of existence, of being human, than like, I think when I think about how we seem to want to trust our sensorial information input, I think that there's room for both. I think they're both valuable in different ways. And I think that what you said about sort of the contract you have with your reader is an important distinction. But I feel like in some ways, do you feel like there's a value judgment that our culture puts on like the idea of trying to accurately represent events versus trying to, because I think that you accurately try to write the experience.
Yeah, but I'm not, but it, I mean, I'm not saying that in novels you don't try to accurately represent the world. I just mean you can also do other things at the same time. You can accurately represent, and you can do it in so many different ways, and you can do it, allegorically, or you can do it metaphorically, or you can do it in ways that might be very confusing to the reader and might be just more abstract. So I think that I don't think that there's anything that's off limits in the novel form. All I'm saying is that I think there are things that are off limits in the journalism form.
I agree wholeheartedly. Sorry. I didn't mean to make it seem like I was, it's a tricky thing. I don't know what the political situation is because you're in Toronto, no?
I'm not right now, but I am generally.
I think I've read before that you think about leaving Toronto a lot or moving.
Oh, well, I did in my 20s. I mean, that was a long time ago. I don't anymore, but it was a big preoccupation for me. I have a book that I'm just finishing editing called Alphabetical Diaries. It was
that was a project I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah. And so I think during that period of my life, there was like a 10-year span, sort of mid-20s to mid-30s or so, or earlier than that, early 20s to early 30s, where it was one of the big preoccupations of my life. Like, can I stay in Toronto? There was just this question of like, what sort of things do you need to do to be an artist? Do you have to move to New York or America, or, put yourself in certain environments? And the choice that I made was to sort of keep myself at home in my hometown or home city and around my friends, and to sort of build the life that I imagined you could only get by moving someplace else, instead of moving there into a world that had already been built by other people, to just try to build that around me and sort of value where I was, and to sort of take it as something that had a reason. Like, I wasn't in Toronto because that was the place to leave. I was in Toronto because that was the place to be. So it was just this sort of attempt to value what I already had in my life, rather than go out in search of something that the world had told me was more inherently valuable, such as living in New York or living in Los Angeles or whatever. But it was a real struggle. I mean, that's what I came to in the end, but I think it was a struggle to just to value where I happen to be, and to make it the most important place for me.
I think that leads me into, I think when I think about what I know about your process, and maybe this is also dated, is that, how do you think the collective, or what do you think, is it important to you, sort of what your friends and how does your community shape your work? And how do you feel about authorship at this moment? Where does it lie?
Well, my friends are people that I have a lot of people that I really am grateful to be in conversation with, and I'm constantly talking to them about what they're working on, or my work, or reading their stuff, or they're reading mine, and just thinking about the kinds of concerns that we have, and talking about books we've read. And I think that I would feel very lonely and very lost as an artist if I wasn't in touch with that in my friendships, if my friendships didn't have some element of that. Not that all of my friendships do, but many of them do. Um, I just really can't imagine being so free in my mind if I hadn't met Margot at the age that I did, and having kind of developed alongside her. We just opened the world up for each other in a way that, I don't know, I'd been sort of set in my ways before I met Margot. And I kind of felt like I was always trying to protect myself from the world in some way, and sort of protect myself from the contemporary culture. And she was very interested in it. So I feel like um, she helped me go against my instincts. And you always hear as an artist that you're supposed to, follow your instincts. But I actually think in that case, going against my instincts, and looking at things, looking at Paris Hilton, in the mid 2000s, looking at all these parts of culture that I would have just reflexively not been interested in. I don't know, sort of exploded my mind and made it possible to write certain things. So yeah,
Can you tell people maybe who aren't as familiar with your work who Margot is?
Margot Williamson, who's a painter and a filmmaker, and a very close friend of mine, and she's also a character in How Should a Person Be?
Can you talk about how should a person be, what the concept and work around that was, and also the transcribing that you did?
Well, I was writing at the time with I don't know, I had this tape recorder, and I was just recording all of our conversations. This was started around 2005, 2006. And I guess I was watching The Hills and a lot of reality TV, and especially The Hills, just very interested in the kind of nullness and the sort of emptiness, but the beauty of it at the same time. Like, it just seemed like, and just the idea of constructing a narrative out of your life, but then also changing your life so that it could fit into a narrative. All these ideas were really playing in my head when I was writing that book. And I taped us talking for a couple of years and transcribed the conversations, and a lot of those went into the book. But I really wanted to sort of look at language in a new way, and sort of understand friendship in a way that, I don't know, I just hadn't seen a lot of literary portrayals of friendship between two women artists. I just sort of come out of my marriage, a very young marriage, and I wanted to think about friendship maybe as the most important love, or a more meaningful love than romantic love, or just ask what friendship between women gives to you as a person, and as somebody who makes things. So
How this again maybe is a selfish question to ask, but what is your relationship with the sort of stereotype of muse? Like, would you consider Margot a muse?
I don't know. I mean, I always think of muse as something that, it's sort of a way of crediting / not crediting women in the lives of male artists. So I don't really like that word muse. We created a lot together. She was making a movie at the same time that had me in it. I was making a book that had her in it. We were much more sort of working alongside each other, and just talking a lot, and having really important conversations, and learning from each other, and learning from each other's worldviews. I wouldn't say that she was my muse. You know, a muse is also like a very still and silent and passive kind of figure. And Margot was anything but that. She's a very, you know, strong and opinionated and action oriented kind of person. So I just don't
No,
associate
I think
her.
that makes a lot of sense. I think
Hmm.
also when I think about, well, I haven't thought too much about the term muse, but I definitely use it when I think about inspiration points for me, and the sort of object, the association with the object and muse, I think rarely is actually accurately reflective of what's actually going on. So when you kind of, so if we talk about pure color, because we only have like 10 more minutes, can you talk a little bit about your process of writing it? Because it's interesting. I mean, there's so many interest points, but like that, I think that this is true, that I read that you wanted to write a novel that was very difficult to describe.
I mean, that was one of the first thoughts that I had, because motherhood had just sort of, I felt like, just been reduced to this book about like whether or not to have a child. And I felt like it was about so much more than that, even though that is one of obviously the things that's going on in that book. And I felt like I wanted a book that couldn't just be put into a sentence in that same way. And I think that actually happened. I don't think that there are any like, I don't think that there's anything that, any consensus that has gelled around the book, you know, maybe. Yeah, except I guess that it's about grief in some way. But
And
I
then,
mean,
oh,
it and the children's book are both that I, you know, which I sent you, Garden of Creatures. I wrote them sort of both at the same time. And yeah, they're both about like living in the world, or what happens to the world after someone you love dies, and how the world changes and sort of is never the same, but not necessarily only in a sad and bad way, like also in ways that kind of light it up and make it shine and make it real again. Like death kind of reminds you what life is and where you are. And I don't know, I felt like it when I lost my father, you know, that was the biggest loss I've ever experienced in my life. And sort of paradoxically, or not paradoxically at all, like it made life feel more, it made life feel suddenly new. Just the reminder of the unsteadiness of it all, you know, especially a parent who, if you're lucky, has been there from the very beginning. They sort of come to seem like, you know, the sun in the sky or the moon, like they're just, you just sort of, they have to be there for the structure of your life and the structure of the world to stand. And so the death of a parent is a particularly disorienting thing in terms of, well, what is reality? What is a constant then? I think both of the children's book, Garden of Creatures, and Pure Color, the novel, are kind of hold that question of like, well, so, you know, our culture, I think, just says that death is bad and scary. And in fact, it's so much more than that. It's kind of technicolor, you know, it's, and I wanted to have that, yeah, technicolor feeling in it, or that sense that like death can make things new. It's not only the way we think of it, it's just taking something away.
I think for me, as a person who has a really strong relationship with my father, and has not lost a parent, it was, in some ways, it was like, you could say focusing on grief has like sort of a or having that, embracing that melancholy. But for me, this was really like, it was so comforting. And I don't know if that's a weird thing to say, the sort of
Oh, I don't think so.
filling the dots of like this unknown with this, I'm thinking about the scene where your father's energy passes into or the narrator's energy sorry to fall into the trap of,
Yeah, the father spirit passes into Mira.
yes.
Exactly.
um and I think uh that in itself, thinking about how we live on through the people we've loved and want to remember, I think is, I don't know, did you intend that to be comforting?
I found it, I mean, I had a very similar experience that I was writing about in the book, and I found it immensely comforting.
I think I think that as a person, I guess I don't know too much about your faith background, but as a agnostic or atheist person, who also is simultaneously desperately trying to find meaning and understand and placement, in a world, in a sort of meaningless, potentially meaningless place. I don't know if you'd even consider it a reframe of thinking about the energy transfer and the physics of it, and the beauty and the poetry behind it. It really resonated with me, I guess. There's this,
Yeah,
oh, what were you?
no, go on.
There was this quote you had that I wanted to mention, on page 63. And it might be difficult now that I am looking at this, without the context, but you say at the end, what were the words that came into her mind as she lay with him in the darkness of his final days? For there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. Is it okay that I read it?
Yeah, and that's Shakespeare. Like, that's a Shakespeare quote.
But I think like adding the history, and also combining this sort of narrative, like historic, like, I don't know. I was wondering if you could talk about that choice, maybe.
Which choice?
And the choice to add the Shakespeare quote, or to think about the sort of,
Oh, for there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. I just think that's true. I mean, it's so beautiful and so kind of heartbreaking, because in some ways, how can you not think what you're thinking? And yeah, thinking makes it so, but on some level, there's a sadness to that, because even something that seems so fragile, so easily changeable, such as thinking, really isn't so fragile or so easily changed. So you need some, what I had, like some kind of like profound sort of paradigm shift, some like lightning bolt out of the sky to change your thinking, because it's just, I mean, that's what motherhood is all about too, like how hard it is to think your way through a problem, where you've been given no alternate routes. I mean, the character in Motherhood is wanting to sort of doesn't want to have a child, but can't really think that, can't really be that sort of person or woman, can't justify that choice to herself entirely. It's just very hard. And so a lot of the book is like her thinking about, how can I see not having children in a way that feels life affirming of life. Sounds kind of trite, but that feels sort of beautiful and whole, and goes against all the narratives of what it means for a woman not to have children. And it's difficult. So yeah, nothing's either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. But like everything is thinking, and there's so much thinking that you do that doesn't come from you, and like there's so much desire to think one's own thoughts, but like how do you do that, when you grow up in a world.
yeah, it's such a not net, but I'm trying to think of a applicable metaphor for existing in a society, and knowing what thoughts are your own and what thoughts are other people's thoughts are influenced. Can we talk a little bit about this sort of working on both of these projects, Pure Color and A Garden of Creatures, for two different audiences? I wanted to start out by saying A Garden of Creatures, it's interesting. So I thought it was interesting. My mother-in-law read it, and I didn't know how she was going to take it, in that we have very different spiritual views, I guess you could say. And she loved it. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. But she was like, oh, Margaret's too young for this. And I thought to myself, I don't think Margaret's too young for this. She's 3. I think this is a great starting point to talk. I think that this is actually, she's ready. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your intentions for A Garden of Creatures and the audience. And I'm assuming what sort of hole, or what something was missing maybe in your understanding or youth of talking about the grief that comes along with losing someone?
I don't know. I mean, I wrote it very quickly. I just wrote it I just wrote it all out. It was like an impulse to write it. And then I sent it to my friend Esme Shapiro, who's an illustrator and writes her own children's books. And I said, is this a children's book? And she loved it. And her grandfather had recently passed away, and she said she wanted to illustrate it. So if she had said no, I would have been like, okay. And that would have been the end of it, because I wasn't really sure. And, there's a part of me that thinks it's for children, but it doesn't have to be children, even though children are the ones who read children illustrated books with few words in them. But I guess it was just, and pure color too is sort of in some way from the point of view of a child, especially by the end. I think that it really comes through that, well, when you lose a parent, you're suddenly in relation to who you were as a child in a new way. You're both reduced back to that child and also an adult in a way you weren't before, because you don't have a parent. So I guess the character in the book, I guess both books have the childlike feeling in them of trying to understand death, trying to understand life, which I think we do our whole lives long. But maybe children do it more explicitly or, more vocally or.
With greater possibility. I don't
Yeah.
know if that makes sense as someone who's attempting to navigate the sort of why is this, why is that phase in development. I guess I was, and maybe that it was intentional to not mention the sort of at what point. So I would argue, and I don't know again if this was something you intended, that talking about death or having sort of pediatric doses of truth and reality in a gentle way are really important to have an understanding of experiences when you're young. But I was curious, I mean, was that something you considered, like the age of the reader?
No, I mean, I wasn't writing it for a reader. I just wrote it the way you write a little short story. You just write it. It comes out of you, So I don't know what age. I mean, I don't know what age is. I don't know. I mean, I think 3. I've got a little friend who's 3 and he really loves the book. So I don't know. I don't think 3 is too young.
I don't either, but I think again, it's hard to, when you're around existence of differing views, it's hard to be steadfast, or I mean, it's hard for me to be steadfast in sort of my view. And so I guess I wanted to say,
I mean, I think adults are more scared of it than children are. Like, I think adults are more scared and like repressed around death, obviously, than children are, like, because they don't know that you're supposed to necessarily feel bad. My friend's dog just died, and his child seemed completely unmoved by it, even though she had loved the dog. And he's completely heartbroken still 7 months later. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that it's harder for children than adults. In some ways, children don't know what the world is supposed to be. So if something disappears, maybe that's just how the world is, whereas you get older, I don't know, there's fewer and fewer things you attach to maybe. And so the dog means more to you, whereas a child is like attached to so much, not just the dog, but like the trees, the sunlight, so much. So maybe the loss is easier to bear for a child. I don't think it's necessarily clear that it's harder for children.
Yeah, I don't know either. I mean, being a mom is definitely, and it's a weird thing to say, a weird experiment in life, and teaching someone, maybe not teaching, living alongside of someone as they grow is for me really riveting, with the possibilities. But I think, like, as also someone who really grappled with the idea that I couldn't be a mother and an artist at the same time. And so I waited a long time to have a child. I think something I wanted to call out, and again, I don't know if this is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but like, there is a very real pressure, I think, in this moment of being like, oh, yes, you can do it. But like, I think something that I really appreciated in motherhood was that the acknowledgement that it is actually really hard.
Right.
And you just can't, like, there's, in some ways, I have this idea that energy is everlasting, but there's like a finite amount that my body has to give every day.
Right.
And it will have to be separated.
Right.
And I appreciated that. I wanted to say thank you so much for doing this and for sharing Pure Color and your experience with grief. And I think as I'm just personally such a fan of the way that you play. I mean, maybe it's not playing, but play with understanding where we are and what it means to be human as an individual and as a collective and as a sort of particle of energy. And thank you so much, Sheila, for doing this with me and for writing what you do and putting yourself out there. I'm very, very grateful.
Thanks, Carissa. I really like talking to you, and I loved seeing can I see the painting behind you? That's your painting?
It's a test for a
Wonderful.
larger work that is not stretched yet.
Well, I love seeing you in your studio. Thank you for the interview.
It's a big mess. Take care.
As it should be.
Bye.
Bye.